So this scene may look simple, but so much work went into it to get multiplayer to work. So first, let's begin by appreciating that there are two players on the screen. So we have my own character duplicated because we have the game running twice, which Godot lets you do. And you can see the other player's movement from the respective screen. Of course, it's delayed, but with multiplayer, it's going to be delayed. You can't actually have real time. It just seems real time, even for major games. And then you have things like interpolation and things like that to prevent your player from jumping from one spot to another. You'll have each client smooth out the movement between the two spots. I don't have interpolation yet because honestly, getting multiplayer to work in Godot was so painful that I stayed up for hours on end trying to figure out which configuration will make it work. So last time I made a new web application because that will be the foundation of what we need to have users. Before I knew about the intricacies of building out multiplayer, I thought it would be similar to building out a single player game, and then you would just make network calls whenever you need to have data sent to the user, and you would send API requests whenever the user makes changes as well. And now that I've actually implemented the beginnings of multiplayer, it's extremely clear how different the implementation of the game has to be. For one, on single player, you give the user complete control over their character, the monsters in the game, over the items that they're picking up, and multiplayer, there are no players and there are no monsters until you spawn them from the server. So the model is actually very, very different. And it needs to be so that you can synchronize state across players and have that state applied regardless of when a new client joins. Another thing with multiplayer is you can't just teleport in between maps by changing the scene. I'm going to draw this out to make it clearer. The way that it's shaping out to look is the game client needs to communicate with the website in order to get the user's account and also to figure out which players the user has. And the backend will also hold data like the user's skills, inventory, storage, quest progress, so on. So once you log in, let's say that your player was in town, so you load up that map first. So your game client will now be communicating with the server, and the server will also communicate with you whenever there are changes that need to be propagated. For example, let's say that you run to the left, then you want everyone to see that you ran to the left. So you would communicate that to your server, and the server will synchronize that state with all of the other players that are playing. And because all of these other clients have the same copy of that map, whenever you do something on that map, you can also communicate with them to tell them to modify the map in the same way. Since each server wants to synchronize everything that's going on, the entire state with everything on the map, and broadcast that to all players, and each player is broadcasting their changes to the server and then to all players, it's going to make a lot more sense to have a new server instance that supports each map. And whenever you teleport between each location, you're essentially connecting to a new server. A lot of the Godot examples are just for one map instance or are for a small game where you could put all of the different things on one screen. Because of the constraint of the server and the client having the exact same game on their screens, you could imagine how problematic and slow the game could get if you were hosting all of the different maps on one screen. Because then essentially you'd have to have the player keeping track of everything that's going on in the background, even though they aren't on that map. So in order to create a smoother experience, and this is what a lot of the big multiplayer games do as well, you have one map per screen and then you just connect to go through to each one. And that's where the trusty loading screen comes in. For my purposes right now, I'm running the game server, the client, and also the website's backend server, all on my computer. So you can see that there's not much lagging going on, but the time it takes to load the game will become a lot more noticeable when my computer has to hit multiple servers outside of my computer in order to get the data to load the game or to synchronize data from other players. In some ways, it feels like not much has changed, but a ton of key things to make it a real game have developed. And while I am really grateful for all the things that I have developed, like all the different maps and some of the skills and so on, there is still a huge gap to cross to make them multiplayer compatible. I need to create all of the API endpoints, make sure the data is synchronized, and really attach these actions to a real user and make sure that other players can see it who are in the area at the same time. So I think this will really mark a turning point where development may get slower but more rigorous, where I need to be thinking about, okay, how do I give the player just enough control that they can do things in the game, but not so much control that they can essentially cheat. And I think building things out so that they're multiplayer compatible from now on will make it easier for me to think about the multiplayer experience, not just building out a game, and it helps me think about how people will actually collaborate in the game in real time. With all that being said, I can't say that I regret not starting with multiplayer. Of course, I've already gone down this path, but I think it was somewhat right to not be focused on multiplayer from the beginning. Multiplayer in Godot, I can't fault it too much because Godot is not an extremely mature game system that's been around forever. So there are a lot of quirks and confusion around building a workable multiplayer experience. So if I were to start with a multiplayer game, I perhaps would be much more discouraged and demotivated in getting it to work because the instructions are not that straightforward. I had to dig through a lot of different articles, GitHub tickets, and the Godot forums to be able to get basic multiplayer working. So there's a lot of room to contribute to documenting how to build out the multiplayer experience in Godot, and I don't think that videos are necessarily the right way to do it. I think one of the things that I realized during this process is that it's really frustrating to be stuck on something and there's no quick scannable resource like an article or a documentation page to reference. When I'm working in a flow, I'm not really going to want to watch a 10-minute or even 5-minute video on someone's experience building out multiplayer. That's the time when I want an article, a documentation page that just shows you how it should be done, what the APIs do and what their constraints are, things like that. And that's really changed my perspective on the kind of contributions that I would like to make. I do understand the incentives of making a YouTube video for things, but it's not a really good way to store information for ease of use. So in the future, I might think about writing written forms of guides or contributing back to Godot documentation directly. I think it's interesting to think about the video format in general, because I think maybe even 6 or 8 years ago, I was very resistant to the video-centric way that things were going. But I guess since then, we've been accustomed to receiving information more in a audio or video form. And I think that's fine for a lot of things. Sometimes you can consume a lot more content if it's in video. When it comes to information that you have to actually use to create something or to dive deep into something, I don't think audio or video have anything on the written form. And I don't just notice this with game development. I think even with knitting, I'd much rather see a few images and some text that show the technique and then move on with my day rather than watching a 10-minute video about the same thing. That's all for today. Thanks for taking the time to watch. Subscribe if you'd like to continue following these game development updates, and I will see you next time. The sunrise is actually insane right now. I will briefly show you.